The drawing room at Ashfield Park held 23 candles that evening, and Eleanor Ashby had counted every one of them because there was nothing else to do with her hands. She stood near the fireplace mantel, slightly behind Lady Dorothea's chair, in the position that had been assigned to her without words on her first week of employment, the position that said, present but not participating, useful but not consulted, a fixture of the room like the brass clock or the embroidered screen, neither guest nor servant but occupying the uneasy territory between. Her gown was gray wool, well pressed, and she had retrimmed its collar that autumn with a strip of ivory ribbon that had cost her 4pence from the village market 4 miles down the road. It was the best she could do. She had known it when she did it, and she knew it now. Watching Mrs. Priscilla Barrow's silk skirts catch the firelight like a second, superior flame. The letter was in Lady Dorothea's hand. Eleanor understood this before she fully saw it, the way one understands approaching weather not from cloud formations, but from the quality of the air. The folded paper, the broken seal, her own handwriting visible at the crease. What she did not yet know was that the next 3 minutes would close one world entirely and open another. She had arrived at Ashfield in September, carrying a trunk of books and a letter of character that described her as diligent, discreet, and well-educated beyond what her situation required. That last phrase had been written with evident approval by the rector of her father's neighboring parish, an old man who admired learning in women the way some men admire rare wildflowers, with pleasure and no intention of doing anything about it. Her father had died in June, in the 4th year of a slow illness that consumed first his parish stipend, then the small savings, then the furniture, sold piece by piece against the medical bills. By August, Eleanor was 24 years old, the possessor of a solid education in Latin, French, history, and music, and 41 shillings to her name. £38 per year was what Lady Dorothea paid a companion. It was a wage one could live within, provided one did not need new boots in the same season as new gloves, and provided one's definition of living was arranged closely around endurance. Eleanor's was. She had been arranging it that way for 4 years. Ashfield Park was a handsome house, old enough to show its bones in the north wing's stone facing, new enough in its east wing additions to suggest that some prior generation had both funds and ambition. The grounds ran to several hundred acres of park and farm, the grass gone stiff and gray-edged by the time Eleanor arrived, the avenue of elms already dropping their leaves in the long October light. Lady Dorothea had been widowed 3 years previous and ran the house with the controlled precision of a woman who associated disorder with personal failure. Everything at Ashfield had its place. The household's 8 indoor staff had their schedules. The dinner menus were planned a fortnight in advance, and Eleanor's role was specified in her first week with the same attention to precision. She was to read aloud when required, accompany Lady Dorothea on calls, manage correspondence when directed, and refrain from opinions that had not been solicited. She had been managing those last instructions with considerable effort ever since. The household's voices she came to know slowly, the way one learns a piece of music by ear. Thomas the under-footman, who whistled off-key in the passage and always apologized for it. The housekeeper, Mrs. Croft, who kept order with the contained authority of a woman who had seen many households and found this one no worse than average. And Meg, the young housemaid, 17 years old, with red hands and a quick, honest face, who had been at Ashfield 2 years, and who reminded Eleanor, without being told, of what it felt like to work hard in a place that did not particularly notice you. It was in the 3rd week of October, on a Tuesday, when the wind came off the northern hills with real intent, that James Wycliffe arrived at Ashfield. He came without announcement, which Lady Dorothea received as a slight. He was, Eleanor gathered from the rapid, low conversation in the entrance hall some relation on her late husband's side, a second son, which in Lady Dorothea's particular hierarchy occupied a position somewhat lower than necessary, but somewhat higher than dismissible. He was shown to the East Wing's second guest room. He came down to dinner that evening without ceremony, wearing a coat that was well cut but not recent, and he took his seat at the lower end of the table with the air of a man who had decided, long ago, that the precise geography of a dining table was not worth the energy of contesting. He did not speak at dinner. Eleanor noticed this in the way she noticed everything at Ashfield. Quietly, systematically, from her position slightly outside the conversation's usual circuit. Lady Dorothea spoke. Mrs. Barrow, who had arrived that same afternoon for what was to be a fortnight's visit, spoke with practiced brilliance, her observations on the season arranged in neat, flattering rows. The vicar, Mr. Alderton, who had come for the meal and would not stay afterward, spoke about the roads. James Wycliffe ate what was placed before him, answered 2 direct questions from Lady Dorothea, with 3 words each, and otherwise conducted himself as though a deliberate silence were a form of good manners that others had simply not been taught. By the soup course, Eleanor had noticed that his hands were still. A man at table who is simply reserved will let his hands move, his knife lifted, a bread roll broken. His hands did not move unnecessarily. They rested. The stillness was not the stillness of emptiness. It had a quality to it, something applied, like a held breath extended over a long distance. She did not plan to speak to him. She had not, in her 3 months at Ashfield, planned to do most of the things she had done, because planning them would have meant admitting she intended to do them, which would have invited a prior refusal. When the vicar departed after the pudding, and the conversation turned to Mrs. Barrow's description of a ball she had attended in September, Eleanor found herself watching James Wycliffe's face across the candlelight while he listened to the ball described in detail that grew progressively more elaborate. She said, without ceremony, "You find the description extraordinary, Mr. Wycliffe, or merely excessive?" He turned. His eyes, which she had not looked at directly before that moment, were the gray of early morning cloud, the kind that carries weather, but has not yet decided what kind. He looked at her as though she had knocked on a door he had sealed from the inside. Lady Dorothea's fan moved once, sharply. "Miss Ashby." "It is a simple question," Eleanor said, because the sentence was already in the air and had nowhere else to go. "It was," he said, after a pause that lasted precisely long enough to confirm it was a choice. "Excessive. Miss Ashby, is it?" "It is." He did not speak again that evening. Lady Dorothea did not address Eleanor for the remainder of dinner. Mrs. Barrow glanced between them with the measuring look of a woman recalibrating a field she had assumed was uncontested. But something had shifted in the quality of the silence between the lower end of the table and Eleanor's chair. She was aware of it the way one is aware of a fire's warmth from across a cold room, present before one turns to verify it. The following morning, Lady Dorothea found Eleanor in the small upstairs sitting room where the household correspondence was managed, and she delivered her assessment with the polished efficiency of someone who had been composing it since dinner. "You are a paid companion, Miss Ashby, nothing more and nothing less. A guest in this house whose attention you choose to solicit is a guest whose comfort is my concern, not yours. You will govern yourself accordingly." A paid companion and nothing more. The phrase was not new. Eleanor had encountered its substance before, in the slight hesitation when she was introduced to callers, in the arrangement of seating that placed her slightly outside the conversation's natural orbit, in Lady Dorothea's occasional reference to her in the third person when she was standing directly beside her. The label had been there from the beginning. Lady Dorothea had simply spoken it aloud for the first time. "Of course," Eleanor said. She picked up the letter she had been addressing and continued writing it. It was 4 days later that the matter of Meg and the missing silver spoon came to a resolution that no one in the household had anticipated, except, perhaps, the person who had anticipated it most carefully. A dessert spoon, engraved with the Vane family crest, had been found missing after a Tuesday luncheon. Mrs. Croft had conducted a systematic search. The spoon had not been found. Lady Dorothea had reached a conclusion that arrived at Meg with the inevitability of water finding the lowest point in a room. Meg was to be dismissed without character that Friday. Eleanor had been listening to household sounds for 3 months. She knew which doors were left ajar during which hours. She knew that Thomas the underfootman had a habit of pocketing small items, not from malice, but from a kind of absent-minded acquisition, the way a crow collects things that catch the light, and returning them, equally absent-mindedly, when he found them in his coat pocket later. She knew this because she had twice found a sugar tong and a small letter opener returned to their places on mornings following Thomas's half-days out. On Thursday morning she went to Mrs. Croft. She explained what she had observed, in specific and careful terms, without accusation, simply as a pattern of behavior that seemed relevant to the question of the missing spoon. By Thursday afternoon, Thomas had located the spoon in the pocket of his good coat and returned it to the silver chest with an expression of genuine bewilderment at his own capacity for accidental theft. Meg was not dismissed. Eleanor learned, only afterward, that she had not been alone in the passage during her conversation with Mrs. Croft. She had not thought to check the corner near the linen press, where the passage turned, and where, if a person were standing quietly, they would have heard everything. James Wycliffe had been standing quietly. She did not learn this immediately. She learned it the way she learned most things at Ashfield, obliquely, from accumulation, from the changed quality of a silence. He said nothing to her about what he had heard. He did not seek her out to commend her. He appeared at dinner that evening and spoke no more than he had spoken before, which was very little. But when she passed him in the entrance hall 2 days later, he stepped aside for her with a deliberateness that was not the automatic courtesy of a man clearing a path, but something that required a decision, something that named her as a person worth the decision. She noticed. She filed it alongside the other things she had noticed and did not know what to do with. The occasion that brought Eleanor to the steward's cottage on the second Friday of November was a simple one. The steward, Mr. Harwell, had been confined to bed since the previous week with a chest ailment that showed no signs of resolving. His daughter, whose name was Clara and who was 7 years old, had been managing the days with a composure that Eleanor recognized with a pang as the composure of a child who had decided that the safest response to difficulty was to require nothing from anyone. Clara sat in the parlor of the cottage with a picture book she had already read twice through, turning pages she was no longer really seeing. Eleanor came on a Friday afternoon, with an hour free from her duties and a volume of natural history she thought might interest a 7-year-old more than a fairy tale would. She sat beside Clara on the settle and read to her about the migratory paths of Arctic birds, the way they navigated by star patterns and by something that lived in the structure of their bodies that science had not yet found words for, something that recognized north without being told. Clara listened with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on a point slightly above the book's edge, which Eleanor recognized as the posture of a child who is listening so hard she has gone very still. She did not hear the cottage door open. She did not hear footsteps on the stone flags. She became aware, in the particular way one becomes aware of proximity, before one can account for it, that someone was standing in the doorway to the parlor, and had been standing there long enough to have heard several pages. She finished the paragraph she was reading before she looked up. James Wycliffe stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and snow on his shoulder from the first fall of the season, fine and dry, already half melted. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not the careful neutrality of a man managing his own company, and it was not the held-breath stillness she had come to associate with his presence at table. It was something unguarded, something that had arrived on his face without his full permission. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. He looked away first at Clara, who had turned to see who was there. "I came to inquire after Harwell," he said. "He is sleeping," Eleanor said. "I see." He looked at the book in her hands. Arctic Birds. She had read everything else. Something moved briefly across his face, gone before she could name it. "I will call again tomorrow," he said, and stepped back into the passage, and was gone. Clara turned back to Eleanor and said in the matter-of-fact tone of a child who treats adults as phenomena requiring observation, "He came yesterday, too." Eleanor looked at the empty doorway. "Did he?" She read 2 more chapters before she left. If you have been listening carefully, you may have already understood something about James Wycliffe that Eleanor could not afford to understand yet. She had her £38 per year, her grey wool gown, and a reading chair at Ashfield that was not precisely hers. She had learned, in 4 years of managed expectations, that hope was a thing one cultivated with the same care one gave to a plant in poor soil, sparingly, and with the expectation that the frost would come. If this story is finding you in a moment when you know what that sparingness costs, stay with it a little longer. The story of what had silenced James Wycliffe came to Eleanor not from him directly, but from a source that intended it as a warning. Mrs. Barrow had been at Ashfield a fortnight by the time she delivered her assessment of the visiting cousin over the morning tea things. She did it with the pleasant, light tone of a woman sharing an architectural observation about a building she found aesthetically flawed. 3 years ago, she said, there had been an engagement. A young woman from a family of modest but respectable standing, a woman who had since married elsewhere and done very well. The engagement had ended, and there had been a breach of promise allegation, and there had been a fortnight of precisely the kind of society talk that tends to calcify around a man's name regardless of what inquiry later produces. The allegation had come to nothing in any formal sense, but the talk had not come to nothing. It had simply spread out, thinned and settled, the way a stain settles into fabric, invisible at certain angles and then very visible at others. He had withdrawn from society. He had come to Ashfield, presumably, because Ashfield was 4 miles from the nearest significant population, and because Lady Dorothea, whatever her faults, did not traffic in casual cruelty. Eleanor absorbed this. She turned her teacup once in its saucer, a habit she had when she needed something for her hands, so that her face could remain arranged correctly. The betrothal had ended 3 years ago. He had carried its consequences in a silence that was not absence, but armor, the kind a person constructs over a wound that has not been properly tended, that has closed over badly, that protests at contact. She had not understood when she asked him why he did not speak at dinner, how directly she had knocked at the thing he was most carefully guarding. She understood it now, and the understanding settled in her chest like something warm and complicated, and not entirely safe. November moved through Ashfield in its usual fashion, the days shortening, the park outside Eleanor's small window going from gray to darker gray in the early afternoons, the fires in the main rooms burning higher. Lady Dorothea's management of her household intensified slightly with the cold, as it always did, her precision finding its sharpest expression when the weather gave everyone else an excuse for looseness. Eleanor read aloud. She managed correspondence. She accompanied Lady Dorothea on calls when the roads permitted, sitting beside her in the carriage, and watching the bare hedgerows pass at a steady 4-mile pace. James remained at Ashfield. He had not indicated how long he intended to stay, and Lady Dorothea had not asked, because asking would have required acknowledging that she had not known he was coming. He appeared at meals. He walked the grounds in the mornings before the household was fully awake. On 3 occasions, Eleanor encountered him in the library, which was on the east side of the house, and caught the pale afternoon light through long windows, and on each occasion he was reading something specific and absorbed, and he did not manufacture a reason to leave. The first time, they did not speak. The second he asked her, without preamble, whether the natural history she had brought to Clara was from the Ashfield collection, and she said no, it was her own, one of 7 books she had kept when the rest of her father's library was sold. He received this information with a quality of attention that was not pity. She was grateful for that. Pity she had learned to recognize at considerable distance, and to sidestep efficiently. What he offered was not pity. It was the specific attention of a person who is listening to a sentence and wants to know what the next one will be. The third time, she was at the long table near the window, and he was in the chair by the north shelves. And they worked in silence that was comfortable in a way she had not previously found silence to be, which was itself a piece of information she was not entirely sure what to do with. She was writing to her father's old friend, the rector of the neighboring village, who had written her letter of character, a man named Mr. Birch, who was elderly and in poor health, and with whom she corresponded monthly, because she was the only person who still did. She wrote honestly to him, more honestly than she wrote to anyone else, because he was 73 years old and unwell, and she had decided, without quite forming the decision, that she owed him honesty in exchange for the years he had recommended books to her and taken her reading seriously. She told him about Ashfield. She told him about the work. She told him, in terms she kept carefully spare, that the autumn had been less solitary than she had expected, though she did not specify why. She sealed the letter, addressed it, and left it with the morning's outgoing correspondence. She did not know that Lady Dorothea read it before it was sent. The drawing-room assembly on the second Friday of December had been planned for 3 weeks. Lady Dorothea organized it with the focused attention she brought to all household undertakings. Approximately 20 guests from the surrounding parish and county, an evening of music and cards, a cold supper laid out in the dining room. Mr. Geoffrey Crane, the local solicitor, was among those invited, his presence connected to some matter of property confirmation regarding a portion of the Ashfield estate that had come to require formal oral agreement among several parties. Eleanor understood she would be present in the drawing-room that evening in her customary capacity. Visible, but not enrolled in the evening's actual proceedings, she dressed in her best gown, which was the gray wool with the ivory ribbon, and she pinned her hair with the 2 tortoiseshell pins she had kept from her father's house, and she went downstairs. The room was warm and bright when the guests arrived. The 23 candles Eleanor had counted lit against the winter dark outside, the fire built high. Mrs. Barrow was there, diamonds at her throat, at home in the room in a way that required no navigation, because it assumed, correctly, that the terrain had always been arranged in her favor. Mr. Crane stood near the window with his glass and his professional composure. The vicar came again. Mrs. Croft remained at the doorway's edge, managing the domestic proceedings with her customary invisible efficiency. Lady Dorothea waited until the room had assembled itself, until the conversations had found their footing and the card tables had their players, and then she crossed to the fireplace and said, in a carrying voice that did not require silence but received it anyway, "I wonder if I might share something rather illuminating with you all." Eleanor felt the quality of the air change. Lady Dorothea drew the letter from the small table beside her chair with the movement of a woman producing evidence she has been holding in reserve since the appropriate moment presented itself. The seal was already broken. Eleanor's own handwriting was visible along the fold. "Miss Ashby," she said, with the pleasant clarity of someone who has decided that restraint is no longer necessary, "has been corresponding privately about certain members of this household. I think it rather important that everyone understand the nature of their paid companion's conduct." She looked at Eleanor with the composed satisfaction of a woman who believes she has found the exact mechanism that will produce the precise result she requires. "A paid companion and nothing more," I said to her in the autumn, "and yet here she presumes." The room had gone quiet in the way of rooms that sense an uneven distribution of power and arrange themselves around the center of gravity. Lady Dorothea opened the letter. She read Eleanor's words about the work, about the autumn. She read the sentence about the solitude being less than expected. Then she read the sentence in which Eleanor had written to Mr. Birch, with the honesty she owed him, that there was a person at Ashfield who seemed to understand, without being told, what it cost to carry a wound quietly and continue, and that she had not expected to find that understanding here, and that she was not certain what it meant, only that it seemed to matter. Lady Dorothea paused. She had read the letter before, clearly, but she seemed to have expected it to produce shame in the room, and found instead that it was producing something else. The room was listening very carefully. Eleanor stood near the fireplace mantel. Every muscle in her was arranged toward stillness. She looked at the room and at Lady Dorothea, and she understood, with complete clarity, that she had two choices. She could retreat into the invisibility she had been assigned, or she could speak. She was very tired of the first option. "The letter was written to my father's oldest friend," she said into the quiet. "He is 73 years old and unwell, and has very few people who write to him. I have written to him monthly since September. The sentence Lady Dorothea has read aloud does not name anyone. It describes what I observed in general terms, because I was writing to a man who respects honest observation." She paused once to make certain her voice would remain steady. "If that constitutes impertinence, I accept Lady Dorothea's judgment of it, but it was not written with intent to harm, and it names no one. It says only that I found, in a place I did not expect to find it, a quality I recognized." A quality I recognized. She had not planned the phrasing. It arrived because it was true. The room held its silence. Lady Dorothea drew herself up to deliver a correction that Eleanor expected to be both well-phrased and final. Mrs. Barrow's expression had arranged itself into the pleasant, slightly heightened attention of a woman watching proceedings that were resolving themselves in a predictable direction. James Wycliffe spoke. He had been standing at the room's edge, near the tall window that overlooked the park, a position he had occupied since the guests arrived, visible but not engaged. He spoke without raising his voice, and the room heard him completely, the way rooms hear sounds that they have not been prepared for. "Lady Dorothea," he said. She turned. "The letter describes me." He said it with the level, unhurried certainty of a man who has made a decision at some point in the last several minutes and is now simply executing it, as one crosses a threshold one has been standing at for some time. "The letter describes me, and Miss Ashby described me accurately, and I would like that to be known." Lady Dorothea's composure held, but the interior of it shifted. The certainty that had organized her actions since she picked up that letter was recalibrating rapidly, and a single short thought moved behind her eyes. She had not considered this possibility. "Miss Ashby," James continued, still at the measured pace of a man who has been silent long enough that when he speaks, each word carries the weight of those that went before it, wrote to an old man who is dying that she had found in this house a person who understood what it costs to carry a wound quietly. I am that person. She was correct, and she was kind, and the observation was made about me, and should properly be answered by me. Mr. Crane had set down his glass. Mrs. Barrow was no longer watching proceedings in the manner of someone who expected a predictable resolution. James crossed the room toward Eleanor. 3 strides, across a drawing room that had approximately 20 people in it and 23 candles. The crowd's faces turned as he passed them, the way faces turn when the center of gravity has decisively shifted. He stopped in front of her. He was close enough that she could see the small imperfection in his collar, the place where the wool had worn slightly at the fold, the mark of a coat worn on purpose, not for display. "I would like," he said, and his voice was low now, intended for her, and incidentally heard by everyone else, "to give you a better answer than I gave you at dinner in October. You asked me why I did not speak. The answer is that I had nothing left to say to anyone, until someone asked me a question that required an honest response. You asked it. I have been working out how to answer it properly ever since." The fire crackled once in the hearth. The snow outside the tall window had begun again, fine and steady against the dark. "Miss Ashby," he said, "would you permit me to give you that answer? Not here, not now, but in full, and at whatever length it requires." Eleanor's hands, which she had been holding still with great care, released. She was not conscious of the decision. Her body made it ahead of her, the way Clara had gone very still to listen to something she wanted to hear completely. "Yes," she said. Lady Dorothea, whose composure had been reconstructing itself across the last 3 minutes, with the determined effort of a woman accustomed to receiving what she requires, from a room, found herself looking at a situation that her script had not accounted for. She had spent 20 years organizing the world according to a hierarchy she understood, and the hierarchy had just declined to hold. The certainty that had lived in her since she picked up Eleanor's letter collapsed quietly, the way confidence collapses when it has been built on the assumption that no one will step into the space it requires to remain intact. She sat down. Mrs. Barrow set her glass on the nearest table. She said nothing. There was nothing precisely that she could say. Mr. Crane produced a small confirmation in his professional voice that the property matter they had assembled to address was in order and required only the consent of the parties present, which he received in the appropriate sequence. He noted, in the dry and accurate manner of a man who has witnessed more than he is paid to comment on, that the evening had resolved several matters at once, and that this was generally more efficient than the alternative. He departed at 9:30. What remained was a room of 20 people, a fire, a window full of snow, and 2 people standing near the mantel, who had just, in front of everyone who mattered locally, agreed to speak honestly to each other. The library at Ashfield was on the east side of the house, where the pale afternoon light came through the long windows, and the snow had been falling since early evening, accumulating on the stone sill in a quiet, methodical way that had no interest in the events indoors. Eleanor sat in the chair near the window, the one she had occupied on 3 previous occasions that autumn, when the shared silence between 2 people reading had been, without either of them naming it, something she had looked forward to. James sat in the chair across from hers, close enough that the fire's warmth reached them both with equal measure, and he told her. He told her about the engagement, which had lasted 8 months and ended because the young woman's family had wanted the connection, and the young woman herself had not, and the breach of promise allegation, which had been her family's instrument of extracting what they could from a broken arrangement. He told her what it felt like to have a version of himself in circulation that bore no resemblance to the person he recognized when he looked honestly at his own conduct, and to find that society moved faster than correction, and that the version in circulation was the version that lasted. He told her that he had come to Ashfield because he had run out of places where the version of himself in circulation had not yet arrived, and because Lady Dorothea, for all her considerable management of the world, had at least the virtue of not gossiping. He told her all of it at the pace of a man who has been storing sentences for 3 years and is finally speaking them to the right person. Eleanor listened. She did not offer reassurances that would have required diminishing what he described. She did not say it must have been difficult, which was true, but insufficient. She listened with the quality of attention that Clara had demonstrated in the steward's cottage. The particular stillness of someone who has decided that the most valuable thing they can offer is to receive, completely, what is being given. When he finished, the fire had burned lower. The snow on the windowsill was an inch deep. "When I asked you why you did not speak at dinner," she said, "I was not testing you." "I know. I was simply the only person at the table who wanted to know the answer." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had caught at the cottage doorway, the one that arrived without his full permission and stayed longer than he probably intended. "You were the first person in 3 years," he said, "who asked me a question that assumed I might have a reason." The fire made its small sounds. Outside, the snow continued, fine and steady and impersonal, falling on the park and the avenue of elms and the 4 miles of road between Ashfield and the village, falling on all of it equally, as snow does, without preference. Eleanor thought about her father's library, sold piece by piece. She thought about £38 per year and a grey wool gown retrimmed with 4pence of ivory ribbon. She thought about what it felt like to be managed out of a room's conversation by the accumulated weight of your own circumstances, to become invisible, not because you had failed to be present, but because the room had decided it was more convenient to not see you. She thought about a man standing in a cottage doorway in the first snow of the season, with an unguarded expression on a face that she had come to understand was guarded at considerable cost. "I am a rector's daughter, employed as a companion at £38 per year," she said. "I have 7 books, 2 tortoise-shell pins, and a very old friend who writes to me once a month, from a village 4 miles from where I grew up." "I know," he said. "I am telling you so that when you say what I think you are about to say, you have set it in possession of the complete information." Something moved across his face, and this time it did not leave. It arranged itself there, and she understood that it was the expression that lived under the careful neutrality, the one that had been there since October, and that she had been reading correctly and refusing to trust. "Miss Ashby," he said, and then quietly, her first name, Eleanor. "I've been in possession of the complete information since I heard you speak to Mrs. Croft about a housemaid who could not speak for herself. I did not require the rest of the autumn to know the kind of person you are. I required it to become the kind of person who had any right to say so." The library held the silence for a moment. "Then say so," she said. He did. By Christmas, the avenue of elms at Ashfield carried snow along their upper branches in the way of elms that have stood long enough to know how to hold a load without breaking. The park was white and still in the mornings, marked only by the tracks of birds, and on one stretch near the north gate, the evidence of 2 people who had walked out in the early light and returned at a slow pace that suggested they were in no particular hurry to be indoors. Lady Dorothea adjusted. This was perhaps the most accurate word for what she did. She was not a woman who revised herself wholesale. She was a woman who, when a room declined to arrange itself according to her specifications, found a way to manage her relationship to that fact with the minimum disruption to her own composure. She said nothing further about the letter. She addressed Eleanor, over the subsequent weeks, with a correctness that had lost its edge, the way a knife loses its edge when it has been applied to something it was not designed to cut. She addressed James with a correctness that acknowledged, without naming, that her management of the situation in the drawing room had overreached in a direction she had not intended. She was not humiliated. She was corrected, and she recognized it. And the recognition was visible in the slight recalibration of the angle of her fan. Meg remained at Ashfield, and Thomas the underfootman was spoken to by Mrs. Croft in terms that were specific and comprehensive. And he was not dismissed, because Mrs. Croft was a woman who understood that the cure for absent-minded acquisitiveness was attentive employment, not the street. Clara Harwell's father recovered his health by the first week of December, by which time Clara had progressed through 2 volumes of natural history and had opinions about Arctic birds that she expressed with considerable confidence to anyone who stayed still long enough to hear them. Eleanor's letter reached Mr. Birch in the village. She had written him another in December, after the evening of the assembly, and his response arrived before Christmas, a letter of 3 pages in an old man's hand that grew less steady toward the close, in which he said that he had hoped, when he wrote her character, and described her as educated beyond what her situation required, that he was sending her somewhere her situation might eventually rise to meet her education, and that he was pleased in the particular way of old men who have placed a careful bet and watched it pay, that it appeared to be doing so. On an afternoon in late December, the fire in the library burning steadily against the early dark, the snow falling again outside the long window, where the pale light had already gone, Eleanor sat in her chair with a book she was not reading. James sat across from her with a letter he had just finished, which was his response to a solicitor's inquiry regarding certain property arrangements that Mr. Crane had confirmed were proceeding in the appropriate manner. He set the letter on the table and looked at her. "You never told me," he said, "what you thought when you asked me why I did not speak. At dinner? In October." Eleanor considered this. "I thought you had a reason. That was all? I thought," she said more carefully, "that a person who had decided on silence as their best available option was a person who had tried other options first, and that whatever had made silence seem best was worth knowing about." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow on the sill had reached 1.5 inches, deep enough to carry the impression of the window's stone tracery in its surface. "It was worth knowing," he said. "Yes. And now you know it." "And now I know it," she said. The fire settled with a small sound, the log shifting in the grate, the kind of sound a house makes when it is occupied by people who are not performing occupation, but simply living inside it, present to each other in the specific and ordinary way of people who have decided to stay. The snow went on falling, without preference, on Ashfield and the elms and the long road to the village, falling on everything equally except the 2 chairs drawn near the library fire, where the warmth held, and the question that had been asked in October had at last, on a December evening, received its full and honest answer. If Eleanor's question, and what it opened, moves you, leave a word in the comments. Stories about the cost of asking and the worth of waiting seem to find the people who need them most. There are more where this one came from.